The evening was nothing short of magical. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the historic streets of Charleston, South Carolina. Jacob and Emma Williams strolled hand in hand down the cobblestone pathways, their hearts light and laughter filling the air around them. They had been through a decade of shared joys, challenges, and triumphs, and tonight, on their 10th wedding anniversary, they were determined to make it unforgettable. Emma wore a beautiful emerald gown that hugged her form gracefully, and Jacob, ever the gentleman, had donned a perfectly tailored suit. His hand rested on her back as they approached the French-inspired bistro, L'Eclair, a prestigious restaurant known for its exquisite cuisine and exclusivity. The restaurant, nestled in the heart of the historic district, had an air of sophistication that appealed to them, making it the ideal place to celebrate this special night. "Are you excited?" Jacob asked, his voice filled with warmth as he looked down at Emma. Emma smiled, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. "More than you know." "This is perfect, Jacob. Thank you for making it so special." Jacob chuckled, squeezing her hand. "Only the best for my queen." As they stepped inside, the soft glow of candlelight and the gentle hum of conversations greeted them. The ambience was serene, with classical music playing softly in the background. Couples sat at elegantly set tables, clinking glasses of wine, their faces illuminated by the warm light. Behind the front desk stood Greg, the owner of L'Eclair, a tall, middle-aged man with graying hair and a stiff expression. He scanned the reservation list, his eyes barely acknowledging the guests coming and going. Greg was known for his discerning eye and his strict sense of what he considered appropriate clientele for his establishment. Unfortunately, Greg's biases often clouded his judgment, something he carefully concealed behind a veneer of professionalism. As Jacob and Emma approached, Greg's eyes swept over them, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly. Though they were impeccably dressed and carried themselves with grace, something about them didn't sit right with him. He quickly glanced back at the reservation list, a furrow forming on his brow. "Good evening." Greg greeted them with a forced smile, his tone clipped and insincere. "Can I help you?" Jacob, ever calm and composed, nodded politely. "Yes, we have a reservation for 2 under Williams. We made it weeks ago." Greg's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping the desk as he pretended to search for their names. "Williams, you say?" He looked up, the hint of a smirk on his face. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight." Emma's face fell, a glimmer of confusion and disappointment flashing in her eyes. "But we made a reservation a month ago. This is our anniversary." She trailed off, her voice laced with quiet disbelief. Greg's smile disappeared, replaced with a cold, dismissive look. "I'm afraid there must have been a mistake," he said sharply. "We don't have any tables available for you this evening." Jacob felt a familiar sting, one he had encountered many times throughout his life, a sting born not out of misunderstanding but prejudice. He knew instantly what was happening. Still, he chose to remain calm, his voice even and controlled. "Is that so?" Jacob asked, meeting Greg's gaze. His voice was soft, but there was an underlying strength that could not be ignored. Greg straightened, crossing his arms, his demeanor unyielding. "Yes, that's so. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other guests to attend to." Emma touched Jacob's arm gently, sensing the tension. She was no stranger to this kind of treatment, but it still hurt. "Let's go," she whispered, her voice steady, but tinged with sadness. She didn't want their beautiful night to be marred by an unpleasant confrontation. Jacob nodded, his calm smile never wavering as he turned to leave. He had no intention of making a scene, not out of pride, but because he knew something Greg didn't. He had long ago learned the power of quiet dignity in the face of discrimination. "All right," Jacob said softly, his voice carrying a quiet resolve. "We'll find somewhere else." "Thank you." As they turned to leave, Greg watched them go, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had no idea who he had just dismissed or the impact his actions would have. Little did he know, Jacob Williams wasn't just an ordinary man. As Jacob and Emma left Les Claire, a tense silence hung between them. The evening air, which had felt refreshing and promising just moments before, now carried a chill of disappointment. Emma clutched Jacob's arm a little tighter, feeling the sting of humiliation still fresh in her mind. She looked up at her husband, her eyes searching his face for any sign of anger or hurt, but Jacob's calm expression remained unchanged. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft. Jacob gave her a reassuring smile and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I'm fine," he replied, squeezing her gently. People like him don't have the power to ruin our night. But Emma knew him well enough to see through the calm facade. Beneath the surface, Jacob was undoubtedly hurt and angered. Over the years, they had experienced similar moments, subtle slights, dismissive looks, and outright prejudice. As a black couple who had built successful careers and were well respected in their community, they had grown accustomed to dealing with ignorance. But tonight, on their anniversary, the encounter felt especially unfair. "We could go somewhere else," Jacob suggested, his tone still light. "I'm sure there's a place nearby that would be happy to serve us." Emma nodded, though her heart wasn't quite in it. "Yes, of course." She tried to sound enthusiastic, but the injustice lingered, casting a shadow over her initial excitement. Just as they turned the corner, a familiar voice called out from behind them. "Jacob, Emma." They both turned, surprised to see Matthew Sinclair, a renowned food critic and an old college friend of Jacob's. Matthew was one of the most influential figures in the local dining scene, and his opinions could make or break a restaurant's reputation. Tall, with an easy smile and a charming personality, Matthew had made a name for himself through his honest yet eloquent reviews. Tonight, he was dressed in a smart suit, with a notebook tucked under his arm, clearly on his way to review a restaurant. "Matthew." Jacob greeted him warmly, a genuine smile spreading across his face. It had been years since they had seen each other, and the timing couldn't have been better. "What brings you two out tonight?" Matthew asked, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. Then, noticing their formal attire, he added, "You look like you're celebrating something special." "It's our 10th anniversary," Emma chimed in, her smile returning as she glanced at Jacob. Matthew's face lit up. "Well, congratulations. That's wonderful. Where were you headed for dinner?" Jacob hesitated, glancing back toward Les Claire, feeling a mix of frustration and reluctance to explain what had just happened. But he didn't have to say anything. Matthew, always quick to pick up on social cues, noticed their hesitation and followed their gaze. "Were you going to Les Claire?" he asked, his voice shifting to a lower, more serious tone. Emma nodded, her smile fading slightly. "We had a reservation, but they told us there were no tables available." Matthew's expression darkened as he looked at the elegant exterior of the restaurant. He didn't need to hear the rest to understand what had happened. He had known Greg for years, and although he had never personally experienced Greg's prejudice, he had heard rumors about the owner's selective treatment of guests. Matthew felt a surge of irritation, both for his friends and for the principles he valued as a critic. "Well, that's unacceptable," he said firmly, his eyes narrowing. "You two deserve better, and frankly, the restaurant industry does too." Jacob, ever the diplomat, placed a gentle hand on Matthew's shoulder. "It's all right, Matt. We've dealt with people like him before. We were just about to find another place." But Matthew shook his head, his determination growing. "No, it's not all right. Jacob, Emma, I want you to come back with me. Greg needs to be held accountable for his actions, and if he won't respect you as guests, then I'll make sure everyone knows it." Emma hesitated, glancing at Jacob. "I don't want to make a scene, especially not tonight," she murmured. Matthew turned to her, his expression softening. "Emma, this isn't about making a scene. It's about making a point. You both have worked so hard and have achieved so much. You deserve respect, and if Greg refuses to give it, then he's the one who will face the consequences." Jacob considered this for a moment, his calm demeanor giving way to a glimmer of resolve. He knew that Matthew was right. This wasn't just about their anniversary dinner. It was about standing up against people who used their prejudice to harm others. "All right," Jacob said quietly, a steely look in his eyes. "Let's go." The three of them walked back toward Eau Claire, the air thick with anticipation. Matthew led the way, his stride confident and purposeful. Jacob and Emma followed close behind, their presence a quiet but powerful statement. As they stepped back inside, Greg, who was still standing at the front desk, looked up, his face immediately darkening as he recognized them. "Oh, you're back," he said, his tone laced with irritation. "As I said before, we're fully booked tonight. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." But before Jacob could respond, Matthew stepped forward, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Actually, Greg, I think you have room for them. And if you don't, I'd be happy to let my readers know why." Greg's face paled as he registered who was standing before him. Matthew. "I didn't realize. I mean," he stammered, his confidence crumbling. "Oh, you didn't realize." Matthew's tone was scathing, his eyes fixed on Greg with a cold, steely glare. "You didn't realize that these two are some of the most wonderful, dignified people I know, people who have every right to be here tonight. Or did you just not care?" Greg's mouth opened and closed, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a defense. There must have been some mistake." "No," Matthew cut him off, his voice filled with quiet rage. "The only mistake here is you thinking you could treat them this way and get away with it. I have no tolerance for prejudice, Greg, and I won't stay silent about this. Either you honor their reservation, or I walk out of here right now and tell every one of my readers exactly what happened here tonight." The restaurant had grown silent, with patrons and staff alike watching the confrontation unfold. Greg's face flushed with shame and panic as he realized the full extent of the situation. This wasn't just a confrontation with two patrons he could brush off. This was a public reckoning, with one of the most respected critics in the city calling him out. Swallowing hard, Greg managed a weak smile, trying to salvage his reputation. "Of course, we can make accommodations. Right this way, Mr. and Mrs. Williams." Matthew stepped aside, gesturing for Jacob and Emma to follow. But as they did, Jacob paused, turning back to look at Greg, his gaze unwavering. "Let this be a lesson, Greg," Jacob said quietly, his voice filled with quiet strength. "People are not defined by their appearance, and they deserve respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Greg could only nod, his face burning with humiliation as he watched them walk toward a table. This was only the beginning of his reckoning. The next part of this evening would be a turning point, not just for Greg, but for everyone who had witnessed his prejudice exposed in the light. As Jacob, Emma, and Matthew were seated at a prime table near the window, a palpable hush settled over the restaurant. Patrons who had witnessed the confrontation whispered amongst themselves, some glancing discreetly in their direction, others more openly staring. The tension was thick, but Jacob and Emma held their heads high, embodying a quiet dignity that made them all the more admirable. A waiter approached, his demeanor respectful but nervous, undoubtedly aware of the drama that had just unfolded at the entrance. He handed them menus with a slight bow, his voice trembling as he asked, "Can I bring you anything to start? Perhaps a bottle of wine on the house?" Matthew raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed with the sudden attempt at flattery. He turned to Jacob and Emma, his eyes conveying both apology and determination. "I'll handle the orders," he said with a gentle nod, signaling the waiter to stay. "We'll have your finest wine, please, and tell the chef that Mr. and Mrs. Williams here are celebrating a very special occasion. Make sure everything tonight reflects the quality they deserve." The waiter nodded quickly, disappearing into the kitchen with a sense of urgency, likely motivated by both fear of Greg and the presence of Matthew Sinclair. Once he was out of earshot, Matthew leaned forward, his tone softening as he addressed his friends. "I'm so sorry that this is how your anniversary night started," he said, guilt flashing across his face. "This should have been a perfect evening for you two." Emma smiled, her face radiating grace. "Thank you, Matthew. You didn't have to step in, but it meant a lot that you did." Jacob nodded in agreement. "We've encountered people like Greg before, people who think they can judge us based on nothing more than the color of our skin. But you standing up for us, it's a reminder that allies like you can make a difference." Matthew's expression softened, touched by their resilience and gratitude. He knew that his position as a respected critic came with power, but tonight was the first time he had felt its true weight. Standing up against injustice wasn't just about penning a harsh review. It was about showing people like Greg that prejudice had no place in any establishment, let alone one that prided itself on exclusivity and refinement. As they waited for their food, the restaurant slowly resumed its usual hum, though the air still buzzed with an undercurrent of intrigue. Patrons cast curious glances their way, trying to piece together what had happened, while others whispered in hushed tones about that famous critic and the couple he defended. When the food arrived, the dishes were presented with a flourish. The chef had clearly pulled out all the stops, likely on Greg's frantic orders, in an attempt to salvage the situation. Plates of seared scallops, truffle risotto, and a delicate duck confit graced the table, each dish more extravagant than the last. The waiter poured the wine with trembling hands, filling their glasses before retreating swiftly, as if afraid to linger. Emma took a sip of the wine, savoring its rich flavor. "Well, they certainly know how to make amends," she murmured, her tone wry. Jacob chuckled, though there was a hint of bitterness in his laughter. Funny how quickly attitudes change when someone's reputation is on the line. Matthew set down his glass, his eyes gleaming with a fierce determination. "I'm not finished with Greg yet," he said, his voice low but resolute. "People like him need more than just a public embarrassment. They need a lesson that will stay with them." Jacob and Emma exchanged a glance, both curious and cautious. "What do you have in mind?" Jacob asked, his interest piqued. Matthew leaned back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "I'll be writing a review tonight, that's for sure," he began. "But it won't just be about the food or the ambience. I'm going to tell the truth about what happened here. I want people to know exactly how Greg treated you, and how he only changed his tune when he realized I was here to witness it." Emma placed a gentle hand on Matthew's arm. "Are you sure about that? A review like that could damage his business, maybe even destroy it." Matthew met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "Emma, discrimination like this should have consequences. Gray has built his establishment on a foundation of exclusivity, but he's twisted that into something ugly. He needs to understand that if he chooses to run his business with prejudice, there will be a price to pay." Jacob nodded slowly, his respect for Matthew deepening. "You're right," he said quietly. "People like him think they're untouchable, that they can treat anyone however they want as long as it doesn't harm their bottom line. Maybe a harsh review is exactly what he needs to realize that his actions have consequences." They continued their meal, their spirits lifted by the camaraderie and determination that now bound them together. This wasn't just a night ruined by prejudice. It had transformed into an evening of resilience, friendship, and a resolve to stand up for what was right. For Jacob and Emma, this night had become more than an anniversary celebration. It was a reminder of the battles they had fought together, and the support of allies like Matthew who were willing to stand beside them. Across the restaurant, Greg stood by the bar, his gaze fixed on their table. He could feel the weight of Matthew's influence like a dark cloud over his head. His hands trembled as he poured himself a drink, taking a long sip to steady his nerves. He knew the reputation he had worked so hard to cultivate was hanging by a thread, and he dreaded the fallout that would inevitably follow. The thought of Matthew's review gnawed at him, each second heightening his anxiety. By the time Jacob, Emma, and Matthew had finished their meal, Greg couldn't bear the tension any longer. He approached their table, attempting to mask his desperation with a forced smile. "Mr. Sinclair, Mr. and Mrs. Williams," he began, his voice wavering slightly. I hope the meal was satisfactory. And please, allow me to cover the bill tonight as a gesture of apology. Jacob looked at him, his expression calm but unwavering. It's not about the food or the bill, Greg. It's about respect. My wife and I came here tonight to celebrate, and instead, we were treated like we didn't belong. No amount of free food can make up for that. Greg's face flushed, and he opened his mouth to respond, but Matthew cut him off, his tone icy. Greg, I'm sure you're only here because you're afraid of what I might write about you, and you should be. The way you treated my friends tonight is unacceptable, and it's high time someone holds you accountable. Greg swallowed hard, his hands clenching and unclenching as he grappled with the reality of his situation. Please, Mr. Sinclair. I made a mistake. I'll do better, I promise. Matthew raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. You'll do better because you got caught, not because you've changed. That's the problem. Greg, until you truly understand why what you did was wrong, people like you will continue to hurt others without a second thought. The crowd around them had grown silent once more, patrons listening intently to the exchange. Greg's face reddened further, beads of sweat forming on his brow as he struggled to maintain his composure. Emma leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Greg, I don't want an apology for tonight. I want you to reflect on why you felt it was acceptable to treat us this way in the first place. Ask yourself why you felt justified in denying us respect just because of our appearance. With those words, Emma and Jacob rose from their seats, their quiet strength a stark contrast to Greg's flustered state. Matthew followed suit, giving Greg one last, pointed look. Good night, Greg, he said, his voice filled with finality. I hope you learn from this, because if you don't, the world will learn about it soon enough. As they walked out of the restaurant, Jacob, Emma, and Matthew left behind a room filled with whispers and uncertainty, but they carried with them a sense of purpose and unity. This was more than just a dinner. It was a stand against prejudice, a moment that would resonate far beyond the walls of L'Eau-Claire. For Greg, the reality of his actions had finally hit him, and he was left with a gnawing sense of dread, knowing that he was about to face the consequences of his prejudice in a very public way. The night outside the restaurant was cool and quiet as Jacob, Emma, and Matthew walked down the cobblestone street, leaving L'Eau-Claire and Greg's mortified expression behind them. Though the experience had started as a painful reminder of the prejudices they still faced, Jacob and Emma felt a sense of victory, one that was quiet but profound. As they walked, Matthew broke the silence. I know tonight didn't go as planned, but I'm glad I was there. People like Greg don't often get called out, and tonight, he had no choice but to face himself. Emma nodded, her face softening as she looked at Matthew. It meant a lot to us. You didn't have to step in, but you did. Sometimes, just having someone stand by you is all it takes to make a situation bearable. Jacob placed an arm around Emma, pulling her closer. We're stronger together, he said, his voice steady. Tonight wasn't just about us. It was about showing people like Greg that their actions have consequences. As they strolled through the quiet streets, the weight of the evening slowly began to lift, leaving behind a sense of resilience. The city's nightlights cast a warm glow, and their footsteps echoed softly as they walked. After a while, Matthew's expression became contemplative, as if he were forming an idea in his mind. I don't want this to be just a story about tonight, he said, glancing at Jacob and Emma. I want it to be a story about change, about challenging prejudices wherever they hide. People need to understand that discrimination doesn't just affect the people it's aimed at. It affects all of us. Jacob and Emma exchanged a look, sensing the resolve in Matthew's words. What are you thinking? Jacob asked, curious. Matthew's face brightened as his thoughts crystallized. I'm going to do more than just write a review. I want to use my platform to highlight businesses that celebrate diversity and inclusivity, ones that respect and welcome all customers. And I want to call out those that fall short, Like Leclerc, I think the world needs a guide, not just to good food, but to places where everyone is truly welcome. Emma's eyes lit up with admiration. That's a powerful idea, Matthew. It's one thing to criticize places like Leclerc, but to offer people alternatives. That could really make a difference. Matthew nodded, his determination growing. Exactly. We can't change everyone's hearts, but we can make it harder for places like Leclerc to thrive if they refuse to adapt. People want to support businesses that align with their values. And the more visibility we give to inclusive places, the more we can shift the culture. Jacob's face was thoughtful as he listened. You know, this isn't just about restaurants. What you're talking about could apply to so many industries. Imagine if every business had to consider not just the quality of their products, but the inclusivity of their service. It would change things. They continued walking, their conversation weaving between ideas and stories of past experiences with discrimination and prejudice. It was a conversation that had taken years to form, one built on resilience, courage, and the hope for a better future. As they spoke, their words grew more animated, and their laughter returned. It was as if the painful experience of the evening had transformed into a bond that fueled their resolve. This wasn't just about fighting prejudice. It was about creating something positive in its wake. The following morning, true to his word, Matthew sat at his desk, preparing to write a review of Leclerc. But this wouldn't be a typical review about the food or the ambience. It would be a raw, honest recounting of the night before, highlighting not only the high prices of the cuisine, but the even higher cost of discrimination that Leclerc had demonstrated. He carefully detailed the events, from Greg's cold dismissal to the look of disdain on his face when he refused to honor their reservation. Matthew was mindful to write with accuracy and clarity, ensuring that every word painted a picture that would be unmistakable to his readers. He didn't embellish or sensationalize. The truth itself was enough to ignite the emotions he wanted his readers to feel. As he wrote, Matthew added a new section to the review, titled Inclusive Dining. He listed restaurants he knew and respected, places where diversity was celebrated rather than scorned. He wrote a glowing recommendation for each, describing not just their menus but their welcoming atmosphere, places where everyone, regardless of background, could feel at ease. Matthew's fingers flew across the keyboard, driven by a passion to create something that would serve as a guide for others who valued inclusivity and respect. When he was done, he sat back, reading his words with a sense of satisfaction and purpose. This wasn't just a review. It was a call to action. When the article went live, it quickly gained traction, spreading across social media and receiving comments from readers who shared similar experiences. Messages poured in, some from people who had also felt the sting of discrimination at Leclerc and others from those who applauded Matthew's commitment to highlighting places where everyone could feel safe and valued. The response was overwhelming, and the story soon made headlines, sparking conversations about the role of inclusivity in high-end dining and beyond. People shared the article, tagging friends and recommending restaurants from Matthew's list, thrilled to support businesses that aligned with their values. Meanwhile, Leclerc was flooded with criticism. Customers canceled reservations, citing the article as the reason. Greg's once thriving restaurant faced a public relations nightmare, with people calling for boycotts and leaving scathing reviews online. The exclusivity that Greg had so carefully cultivated had now turned into isolation as people turned their backs on him and his establishment. Desperate to salvage his reputation, Greg reached out to Matthew, requesting a meeting. He wanted to discuss the misunderstanding, to explain his side of the story. But Matthew, firm in his principles, declined. Instead, he sent a clear message. If Greg wanted to make amends, he needed to start by changing his heart and his practices, not by offering hollow apologies. Emma and Jacob watched as the story unfolded, both touched and empowered by the impact of their experience. They knew that the fight against prejudice was far from over, but they felt hopeful that change was possible, especially with allies like Matthew who weren't afraid to use their voice. Days later, Jacob and Emma received an email from Matthew, inviting them to dinner at one of the restaurants on his list, a place known for its warm, inclusive atmosphere. This time, there would be no pretenses, no hidden judgments, only the joy of celebrating their anniversary with a friend who had stood by them. That evening, as they clinked glasses and laughed together, they knew that their journey had taken an unexpected turn, leading them to a deeper understanding of the strength they possessed and the power of unity. They had faced prejudice, but they had not faced it alone. The next time Jacob and Emma looked at La Claire as they passed by on a walk, they saw that it was nearly empty, its tables untouched, and its grand entrance uninviting. It was a stark contrast to the vibrant, welcoming places Matthew had recommended, and in that quiet moment they felt a sense of peace. For in standing up against injustice, they had not only reclaimed their dignity, but had also contributed to a ripple effect that would continue inspiring others to seek out inclusivity, respect, and genuine kindness in all corners of life. This was their victory, a victory that went beyond a single evening, touching lives and hearts in ways they could never have imagined. A week after the incident at La Claire, Jacob and Emma had begun to see the full impact of Matthew's article reverberate throughout the city. Social media was abuzz, not only with stories of similar experiences at La Claire, but also with tales of other restaurants where people had been treated poorly due to biases and discrimination. Matthew's article had started a movement, sparking a citywide conversation on inclusivity and the power of businesses to either uplift or tear down communities. In response, several restaurants started publicly affirming their commitment to inclusivity. They released statements, held community events, and showcased their diverse staff and customer base on their social media pages. It was as if the city had collectively decided to take a stand, not just against La Claire, but against any establishment that operated on outdated and prejudiced principles. For Jacob and Emma, the shift was more than just a public spectacle. It was personal. For years, they had quietly navigated around spaces where they knew they weren't truly welcome, choosing their dining experiences, shopping trips, and even their social gatherings based on which places felt inclusive. Now, they watched as more and more businesses openly embraced diversity, and it felt as if the city was finally moving toward the inclusivity they had always hoped for. One afternoon, Emma received a message from a local community organization that had read Matthew's article. The organization, Charleston Together, aimed to bring people from diverse backgrounds together through events, workshops, and community initiatives. They wanted to host a Dine Together event at one of the inclusive restaurants Matthew had recommended, and they were inviting Jacob and Emma to be their guests of honor. Emma was deeply moved by the invitation. She shared the news with Jacob, who smiled and took her hands. "It's incredible to see how far this has come, Em. We went out for a simple anniversary dinner, and now people are coming together to fight for something much bigger." Emma nodded, her eyes shining. "It feels surreal, Jacob, but maybe this is exactly what we were meant to do. To stand up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who has felt unwelcome or excluded." They both agreed to attend the event, feeling that it was not only an honor but a responsibility to continue supporting the momentum that was building. They felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing they had become part of a movement that could transform their community. The night of the Dine Together event arrived, and the restaurant was alive with energy and warmth. People from all walks of life filled the tables, and the atmosphere was filled with laughter, conversation, and an undeniable sense of unity. Jacob and Emma were greeted with warm smiles and words of encouragement from strangers who had read their story. It was a celebration of resilience, inclusion, and the power of people coming together. Matthew was also in attendance, sitting across from Jacob and Emma at a table decorated with flowers and small handwritten cards with messages of hope and inclusivity. He smiled as he looked around, clearly moved by the impact of his article and the movement it had sparked. "Thank you both for letting me be part of this journey," he said, raising his glass in a toast. "I may have written the words, but you were the ones who inspired them. Here's to you, and to everyone who stands up for what's right." Jacob and Emma raised their glasses, clinking them against Matthew's. They glanced around the room, seeing the many faces of people who had gathered to celebrate something as simple yet profound as the right to feel welcome. As they enjoyed their meal, people approached their table to share their own stories. One woman, an immigrant from Ghana, described how she had often felt unwelcome in certain spaces, despite calling Charleston her home for over a decade. Another man, a local teacher, spoke about the subtle biases he had witnessed against his students of color and how he hoped this movement would inspire change not only in businesses, but in schools and public spaces. Each story, each person, added another layer to the impact Jacob and Emma's experience had sparked. They listened, sometimes laughing, sometimes tearing up, as they realized the vast reach of what had started as an unfortunate encounter with Greg. Meanwhile, across town, Ellie Claire was struggling. The once bustling restaurant now had far fewer customers, and even the regulars had begun to find other places to dine, inspired by the recommendations in Matthew's article. Greg had tried to regain the restaurant's reputation, but the damage was done. His pride and resistance to change had not only alienated potential patrons, but had cost him the loyalty of his existing clientele. Desperate, Greg decided to issue a public apology, one he crafted himself, in hopes of salvaging his business. However, the apology lacked authenticity, reading more like a thinly veiled attempt to win back customers rather than a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He spoke of misunderstandings and unintentional actions rather than taking full accountability for the blatant prejudice he had displayed. When people read the apology, it only fueled their disappointment and anger further. The public's reaction was swift and unforgiving, with comments flooding his social media pages, questioning the sincerity of his words and demanding real change. Greg soon realized that he was facing an uphill battle, one he might not be able to win. Meanwhile, Jacob and Emma's story continued to resonate, bringing positive changes to businesses across the city. More restaurants began adopting inclusivity training for their staff, and some even reached out to Matthew for advice on how to create a more welcoming environment. The movement had expanded beyond dining, with local stores, boutiques, and even gyms joining in, eager to make Charleston a city where everyone could feel a sense of belonging. After the success of the Dine Together event, Charleston Together invited Jacob, Emma, and Matthew to join their board, hoping their influence could guide future initiatives. Jacob and Emma were honored, realizing that their journey had transformed into something far more impactful than they had ever imagined. One evening, as they sat at home, Emma turned to Jacob, reflecting on everything they had been through. "Do you think people like Greg will ever truly change?" she asked softly, her gaze distant. Jacob thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think that change is possible for anyone, but it has to come from within. People like Greg will either adapt and grow, or they'll be left behind in a world that's moving forward. The most we can do is continue standing up for what's right and hope that, one day, even the most stubborn hearts open up." Emma nodded, finding comfort in his words. "We may not be able to change everyone, but tonight, and in the future, we'll keep making a difference in the lives of those who are ready for it." Jacob smiled, taking her hand. "Exactly. We didn't plan for this, but I think we're right where we're meant to be." Together, they had faced prejudice, injustice, and adversity, but in doing so, they had found not only a way to honor their own dignity, but a path to inspire others. They were no longer just a couple trying to celebrate an anniversary. They were part of a movement to create a world where everyone, regardless of background, was respected and valued. With renewed hope and a shared sense of purpose, they looked forward to the next steps on this journey, knowing that even small acts of courage could ripple out and create waves of change. And they knew, too, that with allies like Matthew and organizations like Charleston together, they were far from alone in this fight for a brighter, more inclusive future. As Jacob and Emma settled into their roles with Charleston together, they quickly became instrumental in shaping the organization's future. They saw an opportunity not only to celebrate diversity, but to actively combat discrimination across the community. Their personal story of perseverance and dignity resonated deeply with the city, and now they were ready to take things further. In the months following the L'Eau Claire incident, they organized forums, workshops, and events focused on inclusivity and equity. They began collaborating with local businesses, schools, and community leaders, making diversity training more accessible and encouraging open conversations about biases that people often left unaddressed. It was an endeavor that required time, patience, and unyielding commitment. They were tired at times, even frustrated by the long road ahead, but they remained resolute, knowing that their efforts were making a difference. The movement grew stronger as people from all backgrounds shared their stories. Some described incidents of discrimination they had faced in restaurants, workplaces, or even in their own neighborhoods. Many expressed gratitude, finding in Jacob and Emma's story the courage to voice their own experiences and demand respect. Jacob and Emma found themselves becoming symbols of resilience within Charleston, embodying the power of grace under fire. One day, as Jacob was preparing to speak at a community forum, he received an unexpected message. It was from Greg, the very man whose prejudice had set this all in motion. Jacob stared at his phone, reading and rereading the email, disbelief and curiosity washing over him. Greg was asking to meet. He debated it. Part of him wanted to ignore the message, to keep moving forward without looking back. After everything that had happened, he felt little sympathy for Greg, a man who had shown them such blatant disrespect and attempted a shallow apology only when his business had suffered. But Emma, as always, was his voice of wisdom. "This could be a chance for real change, Jacob," she said, her hand on his shoulder as she glanced at the email. "If he's reaching out, maybe he's ready to listen. Maybe he finally understands the harm he caused." After considering her words, Jacob decided to agree to the meeting. He had spent his life advocating for progress and forgiveness, and it was in these moments of tension that true growth could happen. So he responded, and they arranged to meet at a small coffee shop downtown, far from the pretentious ambience of L'Eau Claire. The day of the meeting arrived, and Jacob walked into the cafe, feeling a mixture of apprehension and resolve. He spotted Greg sitting alone at a corner table, his face uncharacteristically solemn. Gone was the smug arrogance that Jacob remembered. Instead, Greg looked worn down, humbled, and perhaps genuinely remorseful. Jacob took a seat across from him, and for a moment, neither man spoke. They simply regarded each other, two individuals whose lives had collided in an unexpected and transformative way. Finally, Greg cleared his throat. "I wanted to apologize." Face to face, Greg began, his voice subdued. "I know words alone aren't enough, but I need you to understand that I truly regret how I treated you and Emma. I don't know why I held on to those biases for so long. It's like I didn't even realize the harm they caused until it all backfired. My business is suffering, yes, but seeing the way people reacted, the anger, the disappointment, I realize that I'm the one who's been living in the past, while the world is moving forward." Jacob listened, his face impassive, giving Greg the space to speak. He wasn't ready to forgive just yet, but he respected the courage it took to admit fault, especially for someone who had long wielded his power with a sense of superiority. Greg continued, "I've lost a lot of customers, but honestly, that's not the part that hurts the most. It's the reputation. My family, my kids, they saw the articles. They heard the whispers. They're disappointed in me, and rightly so. I've been trying to make sense of where I went wrong, and I keep coming back to that night. I just wanted to ask for your guidance, if you're willing. I want to change, but I don't know where to start." Jacob took a deep breath, letting Greg's words sink in. He could see a flicker of something he hadn't expected in Greg's eyes: sincerity. Greg was, for perhaps the first time, openly vulnerable. There was a long silence before Jacob finally spoke. "Greg," he began, his tone measured, "change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But if you're serious about this, if you truly want to be better, you need to start by understanding that the harm you caused runs deeper than one bad interaction. It's about breaking down a lifetime of prejudice, of assumptions you've held onto without question. It's not enough to say you're sorry. You have to actively work to be better, to do better." Greg nodded, his gaze downcast. "I understand. Or at least I'm trying to. I was wondering if you'd be open to letting me work with Charleston together. I want to be part of the change you're making, if you'll have me. I want to listen and learn." Jacob felt a pang of surprise at Greg's request. He exchanged a quick glance with Emma, who had been observing the conversation from a nearby table, quietly supporting him. She gave a slight nod, her expression one of gentle encouragement. After a pause, Jacob answered, "If you're willing to put in the work, and I mean genuinely willing, then maybe there's a place for you. But you need to understand that it's not about redeeming your image. It's about real accountability, about facing uncomfortable truths and being prepared to learn from them." Greg's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if a weight had been lifted. "I understand, and thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I don't deserve your kindness after everything I did, but I'm grateful you're even giving me a chance." The conversation ended on a tentative but hopeful note, with Greg vowing to join Charleston together as a volunteer. Jacob and Emma were cautious, but they agreed to give him a path forward, believing that even the most flawed people had the potential for change. It was a risk, but they felt it was one worth taking. Over the following months, Greg immersed himself in the organization, participating in workshops, listening to the experiences of others, and slowly dismantling the prejudices he had once harbored so tightly. It wasn't an easy journey. There were times when he faltered, when he struggled to confront the ugliness within himself. But he kept going, driven by a newfound determination to become a better person. Through Charleston Together, he met people from all walks of life who had faced adversity, discrimination, and hardship. Their stories humbled him, showing him the damage his attitudes and actions had wrought, not just on individuals but on the fabric of the community he claimed to love. Slowly, he began to understand the true meaning of respect, empathy, and acceptance. As the months passed, the transformation within Greg became apparent. His once closed-off demeanor softened, and he began to welcome customers from all backgrounds into his establishment, which he rebranded with a renewed focus on inclusivity. He made public amends, not as a publicity stunt, but as a genuine commitment to repair the harm he had done. The restaurant became a symbol of reconciliation and growth, a place where people could dine without fear of judgment. 1 year after the incident, Charleston Together hosted a community event at Greg's restaurant. Jacob and Emma were the honored guests, and as they stood at the podium to speak, they marveled at the journey they had all taken together. Greg, standing beside them, was visibly moved, his face reflecting the gratitude he felt for their willingness to offer him a second chance. In his speech, Jacob looked out at the crowd and said, "This journey wasn't about one couple or one restaurant. It was about our entire community coming together, recognizing our flaws, and committing to grow. Today, we stand here not just as individuals, but as a united Charleston, a place where everyone deserves respect, and everyone is given the chance to learn and be better." The crowd erupted into applause, a powerful testament to the progress they had made together. As Jacob and Emma held hands, they felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Their story had sparked a change they had never anticipated, turning adversity into strength and prejudice into compassion. As the evening drew to a close, Greg approached them, his eyes misty with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything. I'll never forget this chance you've given me." Jacob and Emma simply nodded, knowing that true change had taken root, not just in Greg, but in the entire community. Together, they had woven a legacy of resilience, unity, and hope, a reminder that even in the face of the deepest prejudice, people could rise, rebuild, and create a better world for all.